people who are like, I love change. No, they don't. Human beings hate, hate is a very strong word. Human beings fear change. Human beings have a natural resistance to change. In social psychology, there's a very proven theorem that is about negativity and how we're all negative people. I'm a positive person. Nuh-uh. We all have way more negative thoughts than we do positive thoughts. We remember negative occurrences way longer than we remember positive occurrences. They pop up in our brain way more often. We look for negative things. I mean, this is an evolutionary biology advantage here because that's how we keep from getting run over when we cross the street. It's not like everything is fine and we cross the street and we get blam, run over, right? So when we've set up the patterns and that this is the way things work in our lives, change comes along and wrecks it all. Change really to our brain means lack of safety. And so when we as leaders or people or friends or whatever, when we announce change, we all kind of get that that's a little weird. And we've seen experiences where we announce something and we're ready for people to be all excited and they're kind of like, or even worse, like they're just stone faced and you're like, what's going on? Or we announce something that we know is going to be hard and the reaction was even harder from that. Or, we write an email, here's something that's happening, and it's like that email falls into a black hole. Do you know what I'm talking about? Right? So today is the greatest hits of announcing change. It's basically the psychology and research and things that you can do to make that change announcement more hard hitting, more well successful, really, right? That's the idea. Feel free to take notes. We will also send out the video after the webinar so you can feel free to grab on. And as we're going through, you might imagine what it would be like if you were in an actual gravity learning workshop, right? It's a little bit different than a webinar. This is very informational based. The workshops are very experiential learning, hands-on. We try all of these tools and make plans for when we'll use them later. There's a good amount of real world role playing. They're fantastic. I mean, I'm biased and they're fantastic. So feel free to let us know if you want to have a chat about it. All right, let's start it up this way. When you send out a change announcement and the only people who reply are crickets, and then basically nothing happens with that later. Here's some research around that for those 20% of you that love statistics, probably love that statistic too. You can eat this stuff up. This comes from two studies. One of them is in the Journal of, the Journal of Research and Reading, and the other one is in the International Journal of Human and Computer Studies, right? Interestingly enough, they're years apart, and the researchers are the same people, right? So when we found studies, these people know what they're doing. Here, check it out. The average reading time, we're talking about words per minute, reading time, speed really, is 225 words per minute. Except the average reading time in email is 296 words per minute, right? So people read emails significantly faster, and it's not because all of a sudden they're significantly faster readers, it's because they don't really read. You know what I mean? They scan. And so we're sending out change announcements in emails, and we're surprised that people didn't really read them. That's just how it goes. I mean, we're a good chunk. It's almost 75 words per minute faster. That's a lot, isn't it? I mean, when we get down to it, there are studies about verbal comprehension of change announcements. The verbal comprehension of change announcements, basically what they do is they say, hey, here's this stuff, and they give them some details, and then later they come along and ask them questions about it and see whether or not people really got it. You know what I mean? It's about 78% of the details people got, not memorized, but got when we announce verbally. And when we announce in writing, that falls down to 62%. You're down to 62%. That's almost an F when we announce in writing. And so what we're looking at here is, if you can, the very first thing, it's real that a change announcement that happens in person or over Zoom or even on the phone or something like that has a much higher likelihood of people even getting it, let alone doing what they're supposed to do after you announce. You know what I mean? And so you're like, yeah, David, I know what you mean, but I have to announce to 1,000 people, and I'm not going to call a 1,000 people meeting, or, I need to be able to send out emails, that kind of stuff too, right? So, okay. In the real world, we will announce change sometimes, especially normal everyday change over writing. What can you do if you want to make sure that that change gets read better, that people actually absorb it, that we build comprehension going on up? If you grew up in the USA, we did all these standardized testing while we were growing up, where they said she's in the ninth grade, but she's reading on an 11th grade level, and you're like, how nice for me, right? Those tests are based on two psychologists named Fleisch and Kincaid, who originally built a grade level reading study for the Navy. The Navy wanted to write manuals that people could read. And so what they did is they said, hey, this is readable in general by this grade, and this is readable general on this grade, and that kind of thing. And what they find now is that for emails, if you write your email above a sixth grade level, sixth grade, people stop really reading and they start scanning. Here are the statistics. If you have a paragraph that's longer than 2 lines long, 3 lines long, that you lose about 30% of your audience. And once you get to 4 lines long, 70% of the people don't even attempt to read it. Now, there are other factors like the length of words and the length of sentences, but the biggest factor is the length of the paragraph itself, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? That it's the paragraph size that matters, right? So if you want to have some kind of like likelihood that people are actually going to read your email instead of whoop, right through it, 2-line paragraphs are where it's at, right? It's not easy. What is easy though, is that when people read, when they scan, what they do read is titles. So what you might consider doing is titling those paragraphs. I know we don't normally do that in real life. We don't say, what's happening? What's the solution? What do I need from you? Except people read that stuff when they scan. If you can picture in your head, go ahead, picture. If you can picture in your head an email where there are little titles above the paragraphs, and the paragraphs are short, nice little paragraphs, that looks easy to read, doesn't it? That's because it is. It looks easy because it is. Your brain gets it. And then statistically, the biggest thing, if you want people to not miss something, is to call out their name and then actions, right? So I don't know if you've seen people start the beginning of a line with an @ sign, @David. I'm like, my ears go up, right? That's becoming more and more popular, which is great because it's the number one thing to get people to read something specific. Here are the big parts. We're talking about keep paragraphs to 2 lines or less. Good. Talking about title paragraphs and call out names and actions. Cool, right? All right. So the idea here is if we're announcing change, you're better off announcing it in voice, verbally. Right? If you have to write, then we might as well keep some concern about how to get people to actually read that stuff. By the way, in a couple of weeks, we have a webinar all about how to get people to actually read your email. You might hear some of this again, and then there's some fabulous stuff coming up as well. Okay, so let's get some stuff out of the way. Let's get the how not to screw it up out of the way. Right? What we're really talking about is how people sabotage their own change announcements. At Columbia, they did this fascinating study about change announcements. What they weren't looking at is what made them successful. Instead, what they were looking at is what made them unsuccessful. And they measured unsuccessfulness in a couple of different ways. My favorite one was which ones led to the most resistance. Basically, it's not that people didn't understand, they got it. They were just like, right? Either consciously saying, no, I'm not doing that, or just sort of in the back of your brain saying like, no. I mean, we make those two decisions all the time, right? All right, here we go. Let's hit the two big ones. Ready? 1, 2, 3, blam. Ha! Surprise. Yeah. Surprise change is the number one resisted change. Right? And you've seen that too. All of a sudden you're like, what? Something pops up or happens and you are not ready to get with the program. In a little bit, we'll talk about why. There's some really interesting neuroscience going on there. It's just that what basically happens is our brains stop, don't they? Right? So if you're looking for resistance, let that change be a surprise. Let that change announcement be a surprise. So what's the solution then, right? Because you're like, it's always going to be a surprise because either it happened or it didn't, right? Here's the solution. Ready? Drop hints. Hint dropper, that's you, right? The most effective statistically hint that you can drop is bringing up a problem, right? So for example, let's say it's not even work related. Let's say that I'm going to tell my parents that I'm moving and I live near my parents. And so that might be a big thing, right? I might start dropping hints a couple of weeks ahead, saying things like, man, the job market around here really is tough. Or things like, you know what I could get for the housing market if I moved to wherever? And they'd be like, huh, yeah. And then when I announced it, it's not such a big surprise. Making sense? If you have things that you might announce at work, you might think about the same thing. In fact, you can practice inclusivity at the same time by swinging by people at work and asking them what they think we might do. You know, we've been having a problem where emails go out and they have tasks in them, and then nobody even replies to the email, let alone do the task. What do you think we should do? And they're like, I don't know. That's a good idea. Mm-hmm. Either they have great ideas that you can take on, or when they don't, they're not super surprised when you announce that change, that we're going to be using Asana or some other project management tracking tool to take care of tracking tasks. Pretty neat, right? All right, so when you're announcing change, the most important thing for you to do is before you even announce that change, it's making sure that the change that you announce is not a surprise to those people. And they're like, oh, okay. Now, again, let's specify that that doesn't mean announcing the change early or individually. That's announcing change, where it's before the announcing change. Making sense? Great. Here's the other way that you can sabotage, and it's really pretty fairly common. This has totally happened to you. You had some amazing idea. You're like, I have an idea. And you bring it to a decision maker, and you're like, hey, check this out. We should totally do this. And they're like, You're like, that didn't land that well. Or they say, we'll take that under consideration, David. And you're like, consideration? Or they're like, great idea. And you're like, right? There's all this pleasure coming your way. There's anticipation about how things might turn out for you. And then you don't hear anything about it. And then they come along and announce the change, and the change that they announced, well, it sure wasn't yours. Right? That's the number one way to alienate early adopters. Early adopters are generally those people who get on board, they're all excited. They're also the types of people who often have suggestions and ideas and really want to make a difference. You know what I'm talking about? Those people, right? Well, they came to you with their excitement and you were like, huh. And then you announced something else. I mean, it's weird to go talk to people and tell them that you didn't you didn't choose their idea, right? There is a fantastic solution, and you can use it at home with kids as well. What you do is you don't say, hey, here's what we didn't like about your idea. Instead, what you do is tell them what you did like about their idea. We really liked your idea because it paid attention to the little details that we need to pay attention to as a business. Now, here's the crux. You also tell them what you liked about the idea that you decided to go with. Right? We decided, or we like, the reason we decided to go with what we decided to go with is because it's really financially feasible for us right now. Right? So here's what I like about your idea, and here's what we like about the idea we chose. This works especially well for kids who don't always come up with a great idea, and you don't want to shut them down. You know what I mean? Right? So everybody feels good, everybody saves face. They get that you're saying their idea didn't have the things. It's just, we don't need to go negative on it. It's neat, right? Okay, so here's what we've got so far. If we're announcing change, the best way to announce a change is out loud. And if you're announcing it over email or in written form, we do have to be careful about writing an email that people will actually read. That what we might consider is not screwing it up before we even start. And that's by making sure we sprinkle some hints, drop some hints, and that if people came to us with ideas, that we set them up so that they feel respected and appreciated instead of disrespected and not appreciated, not understood, and not trusted. Making sense? And that's by telling what you like about the idea and what you like about the idea you chose. Fantastic. So let's get into just everyday change announcements. When we're talking about everyday change announcements, what I really mean is, hey, from now on, we're going to use this form, or when this happens, let's do this. The kind of things that business announces all the time, every day, right? That type of stuff. It doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that it's not really risky, that we're not significantly changing the way our lives go. And that stuff matters. We announce more of that than we do of big, crazy change, don't we? So we've all seen those announcements not go so well either. Say that's what we're doing, and then nobody did it, right? Right? So here's the question for you. Why? Why do people resist everyday change announcements? If you have any ideas, you can go ahead and throw those in the chat. I'd love to see your ideas. I know sometimes things have come in for me and I don't even see it, right? That's not the best. There are things that I read that I'm kind of like, and in my brain, I just decide to go a different way. Huh, neat, isn't it? Okay, well, here's what the research says. The reason, the why around people resist everyday change announcements, it's the why. The why is the why, right? We get pretty complicated as human beings when we don't get a why in our your requests at all. If I'm like, hey, can you do this? You're like, why? Right? It's wrapped up with autonomy and all kinds of other interesting stuff, except it gets even more complicated when we're announcing change. If you take a workshop at an amazing place about learning how to be a good teacher or learning how to be a good public speaker, they will hammer you with start with the why. People need to know the why when they're getting a sales pitch or listening to a presentation, or if they're going to learn something. The why is what engages them. The problem is with change announcements is it's not that way. With change announcements, if you start with the why, you screw up a lot of people. Here's what's going on. You are telling somebody that something's about to change. They can tell that you're telling them that something's about to change. And you're talking about, last week this happened, and so we thought about this, and then this happened, and then we came along, and I was reading, and they're like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? You get those emails, and there's just a whole big bunch of blah, 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 blah. And you start like, what is going on? What's happening here, right? When announcing change, what's important? It's a two-step process. Ready? It's the details first, all the time. Here's what's happening. Here's when it's happening. Here's how it's going to affect you. Here are some details that are important to you. Now, this is the important part. This is important as well. Some people are heavily why-based. You know those people, right? They're like, well, why? Or they say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe we could do this or something like that, right? They're out-of-the-box thinkers. Artists and teachers are like that. And, interestingly enough, there's a lot of upper management why. About 10% of the population identifies as heavily why-based. Right? The other 90% are, whoa, hold on, tell me how that thing works, right? Like an engineer. Here's the thing. If those why people don't get their why, they cause trouble. You know those why people, right? You're like, why are we doing that? That's stupid. Blah, 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 blah. Maybe you are that why person. The thing is, remember, we're all inherently negative. We all have an inherently negative bias. And so when we're left on our own devices to decide why we're doing things, it's not like we come up with positive reasons. So here's the thing. It's a two-step process. Here are the two steps. Ready? Always, when you're announcing change, always, 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 the details come first, never the why. It's different than other types of talking. And then don't forget to include the why. For why people, your challenge will be hold on to the why. You're going to want to lead with the why. You love the why. And you were rewarded for leading with the why when you were in school. It's not like that with change announcements. Hold it till the end. For those of you that are very process-based, here's how it works. We're doing work. We're at work. Let's work. You know what I mean? You folks need to remember to include the why, or you're going to cause trouble with the people who cause trouble when they don't get their why. Neat, right? Okay, look, out of this whole thing, out of this whole webinar, if the only thing that you take with you is from now on, when you're announcing, hey, let's do it like this, or we're going to do it like that, if you always start with the details and then remember to include the why, time well spent. Now, if you're writing that out and you've got headings that say, here are the details and here's the when and here's the why, double win. The thing is, though, is that it's not always a everyday kind of change. Sometimes it's a significant change that we're bringing up. You know, we're talking about something significant at work, a major change, a major shift, right? That kind of business, a significant change at home. Let's talk about that a little bit. Here's the question for you. Why do people resist significant change? Right? This thing is happening. Boom. Any ideas? You might want to take a guess at it in the chat. Tell you what, you might get it right if you guess. Right? It's totally scary. Somebody comes and they break up with you. You had no idea that was happening. They're like, we're breaking up. What's your first question? Why? When significant change comes along, it's even more important to include a why, because everybody is highly focused on it now. When your life changes in a big way, you want to know why. It's not just let's all do work anymore. You know what I mean? So it does get a little bit more complicated when we plug into that. And so instead of a two-step process, now we're going to have a, ready? Three-step process. There's a three-step process to announcing significant change. Now, that doesn't mean you won't say, does anyone have any questions or anything like that? It's just a major part of it is 3 steps. Here's how it goes. Check it out. Here's this guy happily suggesting and making an announcement about significant change. Here's step number 1. It's still the same step. It's still details. Here's what's happening. Boom. No big lead in, none of that. Take that Band-Aid off. Let people know what's going on. Now, here's where it starts getting different. When you bring up significant change, all the time, always, people start asking themselves, why? Why? The problem is if you tell them why, because it's significant, they'll keep thinking about that and they'll roll it around in their head and they'll be like, well, maybe it's actually because of this. Maybe it's actually because of that. You know what I mean? Fears come up. Now, usually it's not a good idea to tell people, don't be afraid, because then all of a sudden, what? All of a sudden you're afraid, right? Right? Here's the thing though, it works when you're announcing significant change. You say, hey, from now on, we're gonna start tracking everybody's work with a time tracker. So when you log in and start working, you'll hit a button. And when you switch to a different task, you'll hit a different button. And people are like, what? Right? If I say the why already, they're going to go away and they're going to be like, are they tracking me? Do they think I'm not working? Am I going to have to be as fast as Tom Vorvis now? What, you know what I mean? And so the thing is if we answer those fears before we bring them up, you can't give people an answer before you bring up the fear. So here's the steps. Ready? Here's what's happening. Here's what we don't want you to think. We don't want you to think that we're trying to get you to speed up, or that we're timing you, or that you're going to have to be as fast as Tom Vorvis, or that we're checking out to see if you're goofing around on the internet. None of that is what's happening. What's actually happening is that we don't really know how long this stuff takes. And so if we can log the time, then we get a good idea of how long things take and we can price accordingly, and then we stop having unreasonable asks. Make sense? When we get that fear in the middle, then we can answer the fear. Here are the tools so far. At Gravity Learning, we're big into, well, how do you actually do it? Small, everyday change announcements. Here's what's happening. Here's why that's happening. Bigger, significant change announcements. Here's what's happening. We don't want you to think this. Here's what's actually happening, right? These are the reasons. Neat, isn't it? The psychological flow of it is pretty cool. Now here's something that we might think about a little bit before we start moving on through change. We've got a couple of minutes left, and this is some really neat stuff here. You announce the change, boom, there it is. And you're like, all right, let's do it. And everybody's like, the first thing, the first emotional reaction to any significant change, Every single time, the first reaction is an emotional reaction, right? So what that means is that we have this overwhelm of emotion. Sometimes the emotion is overwhelm. Sometimes it's this weird feeling of loss or fear. And we've all had people try to push us through emotion before. That works really well, doesn't it? You go through a breakup and people are like, get over it. Or, it's good for you. I never liked them anyway, right? That kind of stuff. And you're like, it doesn't really help, does it? The same thing happens with change announcements all the time. We announce the change and expect people to just get with it. And the thing is that they're stuck somewhere. Here's the way to move through that. When we move out of any kind of significant change, the solution is, instead of saying it'll be fine, instead of saying it'll be no problem, instead of saying like, let's get going, we validate that that is a real thing, and then we offer our support, right? So for example, the way that that looks is, well, I know this might be a challenge and we'll get through it together. Or this is kind of a weird thing for us to approach. And so what we're going to do is have this week by week support group as we move through. Now, if you're interested, there's actually a step-by-step process of the intellectual and emotional journey that we all go through when we have significant change. And we will save that for our change management workshops at Gravity Learning, because it looks like we're approaching out of time here. See that nice little teaser there? The big things, and these are big, huge things, is that when we're announcing any kind of change, we know it's important. So it's really nice to have a structure to lock onto. That structure is, when it's a smaller everyday change, always, always, always start with the what's happening, with the details. And then don't forget to include the why. When it's a bigger thing, you still start with the details and then you head off fears by bringing them up and saying what's really going on. Making sense? Pretty neat, right? If you can at that point be supportive, where we'll get through it together and here's how we'll be supportive, and I know it might be challenging and we're not trying to minimize everything. Now you're doing it. Now you're announcing change in a way that sticks.